Wilson Miles from Black Film TV talking to director Matthew O. Henderson regarding his Netflix film, A King Like Me. How are you?
I'm well, Wilson. How you doing today?
Good. Obviously, this documentary it takes place around New Orleans and highlights, the Zulus around Mardi Gras. For those who are not aware, briefly, what can you say about the film?
Yeah, sure. So the film is a portrait of the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club, the first Black Mardi Gras parading crew that started back in 1909. And really, this film is a portrait of the organization. Its storied history, it's over 116 years old. And our lens kind of finds the club in the Mardi Gras of 2020. So that's the first Mardi Gras right after the pandemic. And our story finds them losing 16 members within 3 weeks of Mardi Gras. And we kind of follow the organization from Mardi Gras 2020, Mardi Gras 2021, when it's canceled. There are only a few times in history when Mardi Gras has actually been canceled. And finally, when the crew is able to roll again in Mardi Gras 2022. And essentially, it's a story of Black brotherhood, of tragedy and triumph, which is often connected to the Black experience, but also beauty that comes out of the tragedy of not only the pandemic, but the incredible history of this organization.
What got you involved to do this?
Yeah, sure. So I received actually a call from one of the producers, a friend of mine, Fisher Stevens. We had worked together back in 2016 on an environmental documentary called Before the Flood with Leonardo DiCaprio, and I was one of the camera operators on that film. And Fisher and I just really hit it off, and we were always looking for a project to reconnect on. And he had read an article about how the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club was affected by COVID. And he gave me a call and he was like, "Hey, Matt, we're all sitting around. It's the first summer of the pandemic." He said, "I just read this article." He had just finished making this film in New Orleans called Palmer with Justin Timberlake. And he said, "Hey, I've a pretty good production base down here. You want to get in a car and drive from New York to New Orleans and see about telling the story?" So we drove 20 hours to New Orleans in June of 2020, about a month after George Floyd was murdered, and conducted 16 extremely in-depth interviews where we talked to Zulu members that were connected to the Zulu community, and captured some incredibly beautifully and raw interviews that turned into the bedrock of our storytelling that created A King Like Me.
When somebody does a documentary, sometimes you never know what the end game is. Because you have so much footage that things change in its path. Like whether it's like this is what we set out to do, but then we learned about this, and then yada yada yada. What was the challenging aspect of putting this together? When you have all this material, because you still want to make it be cohesive enough so not to lose the audience and getting all of this information in.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge with documentary filmmaking. I mean, we filmed for about 4 years on this project, so that was a lot of footage, a lot of storylines, a lot of characters that were involved in that filmmaking process, and it's hard. It's hard, But I think one thing that I learned, this film being my directorial debut in the documentary world, is to trust your characters. We stuck close to our characters, to the participants in our film that kind of like or became our guides, and they led us to the truth of the film. There were, it was difficult because when we started making the film, COVID was a huge part of our storyline. But as we started to move further and further away from 2020, no one wanted to watch a COVID movie anymore. We didn't want to rehash those the triggers that the pandemic was for so many people. But also not only because of that reason, but because I'm a firm believer in this kind of quote from this filmmaker D.A. Pennebaker, where he was asked about how he developed the or refined the verite style of filmmaking in an interview, and he simply answered, "I shot what I found and not what I expected to find." And that's kind of the mantra that we went forward with this film, where it was like, we, especially being a filmmaker not from New Orleans and not born and raised in the South, I'm born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. It was very important that we told the story that was in front of us, not the one we expected to actualize on the page or on the screen. So just being patient and staying close to our characters really produced the film, which I hope native New Orleanians see as a love letter to the beautiful city that they live in.
How much work did you work with your editor in terms of, putting in the right things in place? I'm sure there are some people who talked more than some. They're like, okay, this is a little bit too much, because you want to add as much as you got in. So editor is always key to documentaries because, like I said, it can be long because you have all this footage and you've got to find the right spots to make it fit to so that one scene or the other still engages us.
Yeah, it's a hard task, and I love the idea that your film should always lean. Like one scene should just lean into the other. It shouldn't seem like it's a kind of a hodgepodge of scenes that are kind of just randomly assorted together. And an additional challenge on this film, we actually had four editors. So we had Jane Joe, Peter Schmuel, Jason Sager, and Halil Efrat. So at different times had hands on different parts of the film. And there was a lot of consistency in the voice from the creative side, from producers and associate producers on the project. But working with an editor, it's a beautiful thing, especially as a first-time documentary filmmaker. Because, like you said earlier, there's a lot of footage that you're going through. There's a lot of storylines, and figuring out a way to weave those storylines together in a way that creates this cohesive, educational, entertaining, and meaningful piece is extremely difficult. But one of the things that we did is we kind of used our guideposts as the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club, New Orleans, and Terrence Rice, our main character in the film. And if we couldn't connect any of those storylines in the film to any of those three guideposts, it was hitting the cutting room floor. No matter how much I loved it, as someone who shot a great deal of this film, it didn't matter how beautiful I thought a scene was or how well I thought it worked. If it didn't speak to those three themes, then it wasn't making the cut.
And the movie came out around Juneteenth, and I always say, like, I get tons of emails of like what's coming out around Juneteenth, and I'm like, we ain't doing that. You know what I'm saying? Because we get lost in the shuffle. We're like, all right, but it's out, but it's not a Juneteenth movie. It's a movie out there that came around that time, and obviously we're
Yeah.
talking now, so that way people can become aware of it for its, to stand on its own. But it's summertime, and there's a lot of movies in theater, and there's movies like this one that's going to be streaming. What's going to get an audience to watch this?
Yeah, I think the one of the biggest allures I think of the film, because there are a lot of people, myself included, prior to making this film, that have never even heard of the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club before. But I would be hard pressed to find somebody in this country who hasn't heard of the great city of New Orleans. So that's one of the biggest draws: the music, the food, the culture, the entertainment, the people. All of those things are showcased in our film. Our film is one that deals with a history, a challenging history of the Black people here in the United States of America, but it also infuses fun and soul and movement and dance and lyricism throughout the film. So you're going to learn something, you're going to be entertained by the film, and I think you're going to learn of a history of both. One of this country's largest cultural celebrations, Mardi Gras, that you may not have known too much about. That's one of my biggest joys of working on this film, because going into it, I didn't know that much about Mardi Gras. All I knew was what I saw on the mainstream media. And what do they show on Mardi Gras Day? You see Bourbon Street. I didn't know about all the parades that went through Claiborne and Treme and Mid City. I didn't know about the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club and how much they catered to their community, not just that one day of the year on Mardi Gras Day, but throughout the entire year. So, it's a great opportunity to learn about a beautiful history and a beautiful city.
Speaking about learning something, what's your takeaway having done this film, your directorial debut, that helps you out skill set wise moving forward?
Yeah, yeah. I One of the biggest things is I love to shoot. I just shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot. And sometimes to the detriment of the budget, to detriment of the film. I in the beginning, and this is something that again Fisher Stevens, a great producer on this film, was always telling me. He was telling me throughout the course of this film, stick close to your characters. And there were times where, because I come from a visual background, kind of coming up in the camera department. I would be wedded to a scene and try to force a scene into place just because I thought it looked good, it sounded good. But if it didn't lean, if it didn't cause the story to lean, if it didn't propel the narrative, if it didn't connect to any of the themes that we were connecting in this film, it can't make it. So one of the biggest things I learned was the importance of the edit, and also how important it is to think about the edit while you're engaged in production of film. You know, it's like a lifelong lesson for sure.
Hey, something you'll continue to work on and something you'll learn. Congrats on this movie. Congrats on your directorial debut. Another one. We need more filmmakers out there so we can support them. Let's see what you do next. I'll be looking forward to seeing that. Obviously, we'll talk to people about this particular film, and then we'll talk down the road. So have yourself a good
Appreciate
one.
it.
All
All right,
right.
you too. Thank you so much.
Take care, folks.